Anthony Casamento was hit 14 times on Guadalcanal, and he lived to be 66. On the 1st of November 1942, on a ridge above the Matanikau River, he led a machine gun section forward to cover two flanking units, and inside a few minutes, every man around him was dead or too torn up to work a weapon. He kept the gun firing alone. He took round after round, knocked out one enemy emplacement, held the flank, and then lost consciousness in his own blood, with the dead of his section lying where they had fallen. By the arithmetic of that ridge, he was a corpse who had not finished the paperwork. He was carried off the island instead. They gave him blood, shipped him to a naval hospital in Oakland, and sent him home, and he did not die until 1987. On the far side of the same war, a man hurt half as deeply was already gone, because the army he served had decided long before he was ever touched that a soldier hurt that far should die. The wound was not the thing that settled it. Two men could take the same fragment of steel in the same place on the same afternoon, one in a Marine dungaree and one in the mustard wool of the Imperial Army. And one of them would be an old man telling the story 40 years later, while the other would be cold by morning. What divided them was not nerve and not luck. It was the answer their two armies had already written down to a single question, a question closed in offices and field manuals before either man set foot in the surf. What is a wounded soldier worth? The Americans and the Japanese had opposite answers, and the answers were not opinions anyone could argue with on the day. They were machines. One ran on blood plasma and aircraft and trained hands. The other ran on a code and an empty medical chest. That difference is the reason behind a strange thing that kept repeating itself in the islands. Imperial infantry would overrun an American position in the dark, step across the men lying wounded in the holes, and push on toward the next gun, because to the attackers, those men were finished. A soldier down and bleeding was not a prisoner and not a problem. He was a dead man on a delay. So they left him where he lay. And at first light, the other side came back for him, found him breathing, and carried him out, and he lived. The enemy had not been careless. By their own reasoning, they had read the ground right. They had handed the American wounded the very verdict they handed themselves, and the verdict was wrong about the Americans. It is worth seeing how that verdict felt from the inside, because it was not bloodlust and it was not scorn. It was a settled idea about what mercy and duty were, held by men who believed it about their own bodies first. The American side is the part that astonished them. So start there. When a Marine went down in the Pacific, a corpsman crawled to him through the same fire that had hit him, and the corpsmen carried things that barely existed in the enemy line. Morphine for the pain, sulfa powder thrown into the wound to keep it from rotting, and plasma, the pale fluid that one Navy doctor named in his reports as the single largest lifesaver of the war. Plasma was the trick that bent the math. A man does not die of the hole in him so much as he dies of the blood that leaves through it, and a physician named Charles Drew had worked out how to dry the liquid part of blood into a powder, so it could be carried in a pack, mixed with water in the mud, and run into a vein with no need to match a blood type first. A boy of 19 in shock on a beach could be pulled back from the edge by another boy with a needle who had never learned his name. Behind that needle stood the rest of the apparatus, an aid station a few hundred yards back, a field hospital inside 30 miles of the shooting, a white ship riding offshore with operating rooms in its hull, whole blood flown across an entire ocean from donors in Ohio and Texas, 6 million pints of it given at home in a single year. The number that came out the far end of all that machinery is the one that ought to stop a person where they stand. The Surgeon General of the Navy stated, while the fighting was still on, that of the sailors and Marines wounded in the South Pacific, about 1 in 100 died of it, 1%. A man could be carried off a ridge looking like the end of the world, and the odds he would see his own porch again were 99 to 1 because of the plasma and the ships and the strangers whose blood was running in him. The enemy grasped exactly what the Corpsman was. He was not a healer in their eyes. He was the visible piece of the machine, the one part of it a rifle could reach. So they shot him first. They aimed for the man with the bag and the armband on purpose, across the whole theater, because killing him was how a soldier killed the thing that kept dragging the dead back into the living. The corpsmen learned it the hard way, stripped the Red Cross brassards off their sleeves so they would stop being the brightest target in the field, and began carrying pistols. The Red Cross had been a promise the civilized world had signed in ink. In the islands, it turned into a bullseye. If you've read this far, this is plainly not the version of the Pacific War that gets told most often. Most people will never go looking for it on their own. That is what this channel is for. Subscribe if you want to keep going. Now, turn the whole thing over and look at it from the other set of holes in the ground, because the men in those holes are the ones who did the writing. To be a wounded soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army was to know, with no fog over it at all, that he had already died. The bag held no plasma because there was barely a bag. No ship offshore belonged to his side. No chain of hospitals reached back from the line because the line itself could not be fed with rice, let alone surgeons and blood. And sitting over all of it was the part the plasma could never have touched anyway. A code that made surrender the worst thing a man could do to the people who loved him. Worse than dying, worse than nearly anything. A soldier who lived to be captured did not lose his life. He buried his parents and his wife in a disgrace that, in some cases, drove the wives of prisoners to take their own lives to escape it. So the wounded man on that side did the only writing his position left him. On the 1st of December, 1942, on Guadalcanal, on the same Matanikau River where Casamento had been cut down a month before, a lance corporal named Kiyoshi Koto picked up a pencil. A shell had opened his right arm 5 days earlier, and he could no longer lift his rifle the way a soldier should. He had not eaten because the supplies ordered up to the beach never reached the front. He held no permission to fall back, and no belief that relief was on its way. He understood his position the way a man understands a wall in front of him. The characters came out faint on the paper because the hand that made them was failing. He passed along greetings to the people at home, and he gave the letter its real name. He was writing, he said, to say goodbye. The same river, within weeks of each other. One man carried off it to grow old in New York, the other sitting in the mud with a wrecked arm, writing a farewell, because the two armies that had set them down there held opposite answers to the same question, and Koto had drawn the answer that finished in the dark. The clearest picture of that answer, set down in the most detail by a man living through it, comes from a cold and fog-bound island a long way north of any jungle. In May of 1943, on Attu in the Aleutians, an army surgeon named Paul Tatsuguchi kept a diary through the last days of a battle his side was plainly losing. He was an unlikely man to find on that ground. He had studied medicine in California before the war. He was a Christian, a Seventh-day Adventist who had worked as a medical missionary in Japan until the Army called him up in 1941. Everything in his training pointed toward keeping people alive. On Attu, he wrote down what the Japanese answer to a broken body became once the position fell apart. There was nowhere to send the wounded and no way to move them, and surrender was forbidden. So, in his own words, the worst of them were dealt with through morphine. They gave 400 shots of morphine to severely wounded, and it kills them. And killing them was the point. In the middle of those same pages, half lost between the deaths, he wrote that he had managed to cook a thistle and eat it, and that no fresh food had passed his mouth in 6 months. A man recording the end of his world stops to mark a roadside weed he boiled because he was starving, and it tasted good. Then he went back to the dying. His final entry was made before a last charge that every man understood was a way to die rather than a way to win. He recorded that the patients still in the hospital had been made to take their own lives, and in one of the translations the line is flatter and worse than that he had seen to all of them himself with grenades. When American infantry pushed into the Japanese hospital tents a short while later, they found that every wounded man inside had been killed by his own doctors to spare him the dishonor of capture. Of roughly 2,600 Japanese on Attu, 28 came off the island breathing. The soldier who came across Tatsuguchi's body and killed him as he joined the charge picked the diary up off the ground and carried it away. His diary was rendered into English more than once by different hands, and the surviving versions do not match word for word across those last lines. What the phrasing points at does not shift at all. This is the point where it would be easy and wrong to reach for outrage. What the doctor did on Attu was not cruelty in the way an American reader feels it first. By the lights of his own army, it was the reverse of cruelty. It was mercy and duty pressed into a single act. A wounded man who could not fight, could not be carried, and could not be allowed to live as a prisoner was inside that system, gone already. And the morphine and the grenade did no more than make official what every man in the tent already knew. That was the judgment the Japanese soldier carried into every fight. It was the judgment he expected for himself, in the same needle, with the same calm. And it was the judgment, to the letter, that he handed the American wounded he stepped over on Guadalcanal. Leaving those men was not callousness, it was consistency. He had the meaning of such a wound right. The one thing he had wrong was the other world, the one with the plasma and the ships, where the identical wound meant a man went home and mowed his lawn for another 50 years. There was a sharper edge to that consistency, and the Americans ran into it early. On the Tenaru in August of 1942, Marines who walked out to check the Japanese dead after a broken night assault found that some of the men on the ground were not as finished as they looked. One would lie still until the Americans bent over him, then pull the pin on a grenade and take both of them out of the war together. The Marine general watching it set the thing down in flat disbelief that these people would not surrender, that the hurt among them waited for someone to come close and then blew themselves and the nearest man to pieces. To the Marines, it was treachery. To the man holding the grenade, it was no such thing. He was already dead by the one reckoning that ruled him, and a dead man who could still pull an enemy down with him was doing the last duty his army had left him. The verdict ran all the way to the bottom, and it is most of the reason the island fighting hardened into a war with no quarter in it, in which the side that had built a machine to drag its own wounded back out learned to stop walking out after the enemies. Anthony Casamento spent a good part of the life he almost lost on that ridge, fighting for the right to be believed. The men who had watched him hold that ridge were thought to have all died on it, which is part of why his award was knocked down to a lesser medal in the years after the war. There was no one left, the reasoning went, to swear to what he had done. He did not let it rest. An old man in a wheelchair, he parked himself outside the White House and stayed there for 51 days. In time, 2 witnesses to that morning turned out to have lived after all, and in 1980, 38 years after the ridge, a president hung the Medal of Honor around his neck. The man the war had every reason to write off had outlasted not only his wounds, but the paperwork that tried to forget them. So it comes down to 2 soldiers and 1 splinter of steel. The American takes it and lives, not for being braver or harder than the man across the wire, but because a vast and patient machine had been assembled for the single purpose of refusing to let him die, and it poured out blood and aircraft and money on him without once asking whether he had earned it. The Japanese soldier takes the same steel and dies, not through anyone's hatred, but since the system that owned him had ruled, before he was grown, that a wounded man is a finished man, and it acted on the ruling with a needle or a grenade or by keeping the bag empty. Both men did just what their armies asked of them. Both obeyed. The gap between what became of them was total, and neither one chose it. The heaviest part, the part that turns a tidy comparison into something that sits in the chest, is that the Japanese soldier knew. He was not fooled about his odds the way a man can be fooled in the noise of a fight. Koto knew he was a dead man when he lifted the pencil. Tatsuguchi knew it when he ate the thistle. They had been told by the one authority they had ever answered to that a wounded man is a dead man, and they believed it because in their war it was true. And then they sat down and wrote about it in their own steady hands while there was still light to write by. That is the answer to the question of what Japanese soldiers wrote. They did not leave behind astonished little notes about enemy wounded who would not stay dead, because survival on that scale was the Americans' strange luxury, and a starving man on a folding front had no spare hours to marvel at it. What they wrote were farewell letters and a doctor's log. The private papers of men who were themselves the wounded their own side would not come back for. The papers outlived the men who made them. Koto's letter was lifted off his body and turned into English by the people who had beaten him. Tatsuguchi's diary rode off Attu in the pack of the American who had just killed him, and went on to be read by more people in the country that defeated him than he could ever have pictured at his writing. Both men were dead before a single soul on the other side read one word they had set down, and what they had set down was never, in the end, about the enemy at all.